God, it's good to be home. I'll tell you, I really appreciate coming back to Chicago. It's a place that profoundly shaped who I am, what I became, and there's no doubt in my mind that I would not be the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture if I hadn't spent my time here, so I'm always indebted to Chicago. But I have to admit, I appreciate that kind introduction because I always realize that my staff sends out my bio. And when they send out my bio, they tell you everything about me, except I was president of my third grade class 2 years in a row. There's hope for us all. I'm going to talk tonight about the challenge of building a national museum and to talk a little bit about those challenges, both professional and personal, that really shaped this journey. And I guess since I'm a historian, let me begin with a story. Early in my career at the Smithsonian, I was asked to curate an exhibition on the 19th century of America. And one of the stories I wanted to look at was the story of slavery. But I didn't want to do a broad story of the institution of slavery. I wanted to focus on slavery through the aspects of a single plantation. So I traveled all over the country looking for plantations. I went to Louisiana and looked at sugar plantations. I was in North Carolina looking at tobacco plantations. I spent a lot of time in Alabama and Mississippi looking at cotton plantations. And then I stumbled upon the rice-producing area outside of Georgetown, South Carolina. And I found a plantation called the Friendfield Plantation. And when I drove down the road, suddenly I turned the corner and there were 10 slave cabins from the 1840s still standing. And next to those cabins was a man who was 93 years old. His name was Mr. Johnson. Never learned his first name. Mr. Johnson had lived in one of those cabins with his enslaved grandmother. So you could imagine, for a historian, this is the Holy Grail. Somebody who could tell you what it was like to live in a slave cabin, to be enslaved. And Mr. Johnson was amazing. He took me to the front of the cabin, and he talked about how his grandmother and the enslaved people took a broom and did a hard sweep to make the ground so hard there would be no grass, but therefore no vermin. And then he took me to one side, and he talked for 20 minutes about the role children played in watching the chimney, making sure it didn't catch fire or fall over. He took me to the back, and he talked about how his grandmother grew all these crops to supplement what the master gave them. And then we went to the fourth side, or rather, I went to the fourth side. Mr. Johnson didn't come. I asked Mr. Johnson, what happened over here? He said, son, I'm not going over there. Well, with the kind of curiosity of a young scholar, I said, there's got to be something really important here. I said, Mr. Johnson, please come over here and tell me what happened. He said, son, if I were you, I wouldn't stand there. And I said, why? He said, because there's nothing but rattlesnakes over there. Now, after I stopped running, I asked Mr. Johnson, I said, why didn't you tell me? And he said, son, everybody used to remember, now they forget. He said, if you're a historian, your job is to help people remember not just what they want, but what they need. And in some ways, the struggle to help America remember not just what it wants, but what it needs about the African American experience has been a 100-year struggle. The idea for this museum began in 1913. 1913 was the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And many of you may remember there's a series of pictures of old Yankees and old rebels shaking hands, saying the war is over. But you never see anybody African American in those pictures. And yet 200,000 African Americans participated in the war. So there was this great push to get a presence on the mall. And there was fundraising, but then a war broke out. War took priority, no presence on the mall. This idea picked up again in the 1920s, led by, believe it or not, Calvin Coolidge. How often do you say Calvin Coolidge? But Calvin Coolidge led a struggle to get this museum up, and then the Great Depression hit. The idea then lay fallow until after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, there was this push. But the idea for a museum was killed in the 90s when a senator from North Carolina decided it shouldn't happen. It only became real in 2003 when President George Bush signed the legislation. And it happened for simple reasons. First of all, you had, for the first time, a real bipartisan effort. This idea was led by John Lewis, but also Sam Brownback from Kansas. I know, strange bedfellows. But the reality is that bipartisan nature led to the successful creation of the museum. But even more importantly than that was the fact that people began to realize that the civil rights movement was so important, and yet many of the leaders of that movement were passing from the scene. So there was a desire to remember them, to tell their story, and it led to the creation of this National Museum. But I have to tell you, I came back 9 years ago, and 9 years ago, I had a staff of 2. I had no idea where the museum would be, no location, clearly no architect. We had, unlike most museums, not a single item in the collection. And we knew that it was going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build this museum, and we had not a penny there. But 9 years later, we now have a staff of 150 people working to birth this museum. We've collected over 35,000 artifacts. We have gone from no money raised to $440 million being raised to build this museum. And we've gone from being homeless to having the best site in America, as I'll show you soon, next to the Washington Monument within the shadow of the White House. So on paper, all is right with the world. But the reality is the challenges to do this are really something that I want to share with you today. Because basically, the reality is that at 8 o'clock in the morning, I have the best job in America. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, this is the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. One of the first great challenges was to figure out what is a National Museum of African American History and Culture in the 21st century. What is a museum of this type on the National Mall? So the question was, how do you create and define this museum? Well, part of it was easy. My time in Chicago, many people, some in this audience, shaped who I am. One of the people who profoundly influenced me was a woman by the name of Mamie Mobley. She was the mother of Emmett Till, who was murdered in 1955. And Mamie used to talk to me all the time about how she carried that memory, and she felt it was important that somebody else would carry the memory of Emmett Till. And I realized then that part of the museum's job was simple. It had to be a place to help you remember. It had to help you remember, the people you know in new ways, to remember the Frederick Douglasses and the Sojourner Truths and the Rosa Parks. But it also had to introduce you to a world that we don't know, to those left out of the narrative. It had to introduce you to the enslaved woman who got up every morning and fed her kids before she went into the fields, and she refused to let the field strip her of her humanity, of her humor. It had to remember the family that left Mississippi in 1913 for the South Side of Chicago. It had to remember the woman who quit Brandeis University in 1964 to go down south to register people in Mississippi. And it had to remember people like my grandmother, who took in other people's wash, scrubbed other people's floors, so her children and grandchildren wouldn't have to. In some ways, the museum had to be a place that allowed America to wrestle with its tortured racial past. It had to be a place that would allow you to cry as you ponder the pain of slavery and segregation. But it also had to be a place that allowed you to find the joy that is in this community. You needed to be able to tap your toes to Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Aretha Franklin, or somebody from the hip-hop world. I have no idea who it is. You needed to be a place that would let you find reconciliation and healing. But in some ways, if the museum was only about remembering, then I'm not sure it should be a national museum. In some ways, what has made this so important for us is to recognize that what this museum tries to do is to use African American culture as a lens to better understand what it means to be an American. In essence, this is a museum that is not by and for African Americans. In essence, this is a museum that says the African American experience is the quintessential American experience. When we think of core American values of spirituality, optimism, resiliency, where better to look? When we think of the expansion of liberty and citizenship, where better to look? When we think of the promise of American life and the limits of that promise, where better to look? So for us, what's crucially important is to recognize that this is a museum that tells a story that shapes us all. Whether your family's been here 200 years or got here 20 minutes ago, this is your story. But I also think to make it the museum of the 21st century, it had to be a place that emphasized collaboration. There are amazing museums around the world, around this country, in the city of Chicago, who have done important work. And what we needed to do was find a way to be a collaborative partner, to recognize that the Smithsonian was not the fount of all knowledge. But what was important is to recognize what the Smithsonian is. It is a place that people will come to, that people will trust, that people will wrestle with subjects that they won't visit in their own hometown. And so what we wanted to be was to be a museum that was a beacon, that would draw you to Washington, either actually or virtually. And then we'd push you back to local museums. If there was an exhibition on the migration of blacks from the south to the north, we'd say, see how that is played out at the DuSable Museum, or how does the California African American Museum explore it? The goal was to make sure that everybody benefited by the presence of this museum. But also, what was really important for us was to recognize that we needed to shape this museum in a way that explored our international context. One of the things we know as Americans, we don't do global very well. And one of our challenges is to craft a museum that says this story, this history has been profoundly shaped by international considerations, and the African American experience continues to echo in profound ways around the globe today. And that was really brought home to me by a trip that I took several years ago to Lapland in Sweden. It has to do with fourth grade geography. I won't bore you with the details, but I'm sitting in Lapland under a reindeer tent talking to a village elder through the translator. And he looks at me and he says, "Are you an American?" "Yep." He said, "I got another question." "What's that?" "Do you know Al Green?" I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Al Green," and he starts to sing. I realized right then and there, there's a power here that I hadn't seen. And of course, I came back and I called Al Green. He said, "Of course they know me in Lapland." But in some ways, crafting the vision was the easy part. But implementing that vision, making it real, was really one of the great challenges. And think about it. One of the great troubles is to figure out, okay, when all is said and done, what is this museum? What are the conceptual challenges that shape it? After all, you can ask yourself many questions. How can a museum be comprehensive but not encyclopedic? What's the role of Africa in an African American museum? What's the role of a national museum in a transnational age? Can a museum really bring truth, reconciliation, and healing? And maybe more importantly to me, can a museum do something, a museum of history, can it really help people explore difficult questions in a way that doesn't give simple answers to complex questions? Can it be a museum that helps people embrace ambiguity, to understand the power of wrestling with the shades of gray, to look at undefined issues? Can a museum really do that? And so the challenge was, what is in this museum? So we began as a staff to make circles on the wall and fill out and put in what we thought was important. I said, what are the stories we have to tell? Well, do we have to tell civil rights? Probably. Do you have to tell sports? Do you have to tell slavery? And on, and ultimately we had a list that would require 4 buildings. Now, I knew the Smithsonian loved us, but we weren't getting 4 buildings. So the challenge was how to narrow that down. And we did it in really a simple way. We spent 2 years doing focus groups, talking to average people, getting what they knew and what they wanted. And then we married that with another year of working with the best scholars in the world to find that tension between what people wanted and what people needed. And in some ways, the challenge for us was to figure out how to do that, especially because, as I said earlier, the museum did not have a single object to do that. So trying to figure out how do we define this museum, how to make a vision real, was really a great challenge. But if I have to be honest, one of the biggest challenges that I thought we'd have was the challenge of managing Congress. I know that's an oxymoron, but you know, the Smithsonian, and in fact this museum, the biggest donor for this museum is the United States Congress. 50% of the cost of building a building should be borne by the US Congress. And if you're part of the Smithsonian, 70, 80, 90% of your staff are federal employees. So the notion is, to be successful, you're going to have to find ways to manage Congress. So when I first came back, they said to me, well, we're going to have you go visit all the different appropriators in the Senate and the House. And then they said, but however, there's one that really, I don't think he's going to like you. So I want to warn you that. So this man was a congressman from North Carolina, and I was told that he was going to be very, very difficult, and I was going to see him on a Thursday. On a Wednesday night, I was at a reception at the Library of Congress, and there he was. So I started chatting with him. He's from North Carolina, my mother's from North Carolina. We had the best time. So I figured the next day, piece of cake, I've got this. I walk into his office, and he's got one of those desks that he's up here and your chair is down here. And he's got 15 members of his staff standing against the wall and me. So I said, Mr. Congressman, he cuts me right off. He says, listen, I want to be clear. I do not think your museum should exist. I don't think I like you. I'm not even sure I like the Smithsonian. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you $25,000, make it virtual, and make it go away. Make it the virtual museum. And I'm stunned. I don't know what to say. He's going on and on about the virtual. Finally, he slows up, and I said, well, you know, for many years, I was at the Museum of American History, and I saw the power of the authentic. I watched people be touched by the Star-Spangled Banner or moved by the Greensboro lunch counter. Well, suddenly, he starts to shake, and he gets red, and he's starting to hold his throat, and I'm thinking, Christ, Bunch kills congressman, news at 11. I figured my career is over. He starts crying. Well, his staff ushers me out. I don't know what's going on. And I'm trying to figure out if I can get my job back in Chicago. I mean, I just didn't know what to do. He comes out, and he puts his arm around me, and he says, you helped me remember. I forgot that during the Greensboro sit-in in 1960, I was a student at Wake Forest, and I raised money to help people get out of jail. And I was really pleased, and he said, you know what? I like you. I'm not going to give you any money, but I like you. I won't say it, but the good news is he lost the re-election. But they, you know, I didn't have anything to do with that. But in some ways, what has really surprised us in a positive way is that we have really been able to be one of the few bipartisan things in Washington. It helps having Sam Brown back. Laura Bush is on the board of this museum. Colin Powell is on the board. We've been able to make sure that it was seen as something that was for all America, not for one particular party. And so even though my big worry was that we would struggle with Congress, Congress has really been, I don't get to say this much, Congress has really been very good and very good to us. And so I'm very pleased about that. But that is always an ongoing challenge to wrestle with Congress. But I'll tell you, the issue that is really the thorniest of the challenges is really the conflicting audience needs and expectations. Not too long ago, I got a letter, and the letter began, "Dear left-wing historian." Now, I'm smart enough to know that's not a love letter, okay? And the author, but it was very serious. He went on to say, what happened to the Smithsonian I loved? It used to be a place that celebrated America, that talked about our triumphs, talked about our technological innovation. And now you're going to create a museum that's going to tell us things that are better left unsaid. He then went on to say it was really horrible that we should build this museum, it should never happen, and that historians like me should be fired. Although I must admit it threw me off because he signed the letter, best wishes for your continued success. But I think that notion of saying, how do you shape what this museum can be for many people has been a challenge. We've had many people from the African American community saying to me, this has to be a Holocaust museum. This has to be a museum that says what they did to us. I get other people saying this needs to be a museum that educates and inspires. So don't talk about slavery. Try not to talk about those difficult moments. In some ways, the real challenge for this museum is to find that tension between stories of pain and stories of resiliency, to be able to help the American public negotiate those different visions of what this history, what this culture would be. And I think the key for us is to do that by both understanding our audience and by working with the best scholars in the country to get that working right. But the other challenge is that many people say, well, you know, dealing with tough issues around race, you've already got models. You've got the Holocaust Museum. And what I realized, though, is the Holocaust Museum has one very different element than this museum. In the Holocaust Museum, the bad guys weren't American. And the real challenge is, how do we craft a place that allows America to wrestle with its complicity, but not be a place that's about guilt and finger pointing, but about illuminating all the dark corners of the American experience. And I think that's really one of the challenges. And normally when I get these letters, I respond in a very polite way. But I got one not too long ago from some guy who went on, who said that he had seen work that I had done here in Chicago, and that we had told stories that embarrassed the black community. We told stories of violence, and he said that that's a horrible thing, and he wanted to know who bribed me, who got to me. He wanted to know in the letter who gave me 30 pieces of silver. Now, normally I let that go, but he made a mistake. He left his phone number. So I called him, and I said, look, I want to explain something to you. You clearly have little understanding of what historians do, because nobody gives us 30 pieces of silver. And then I hung up, so I felt like I won. In some ways, when I think about the things that made this so difficult and the challenges that we faced us, one of the things that everybody thought was going to be the biggest deal was really the notion of fundraising. But I have to tell you, we have been very fortunate because of the leadership of our board, our council, and here in the audience is our co-chair, Linda Johnson-Rice, who has really been one of the great leaders. So Linda, thank you so much for what you've done. When we realized how much money we'd have to raise, I remember I told my mother I was taking this new job, and she said, okay, so how much money do you have to raise? I said, $500 million. She said, son, that's more money than God can count. And I remember thinking, uh-oh, I'm really over my head. But the reality is that because of this board led by Linda and Dick Parsons, we've been able to sort of get the support from the corporate community, from the foundation community, and that in many ways the fundraising is a challenge because the number is so large. But the reality is that people have been unbelievably supportive, and I have to tell you, that has been one of the things that I am not as worried about as I thought I would be. But I must tell you, the area that concerned me, the challenge that concerned me the most, was really the challenge of building the collections. After all, most museums have a collection. And when I looked around the Smithsonian, where I worked for so many years, I thought, even if I took everything out of every other museum in the Smithsonian, it would only give me 20% of what I needed. And I never wanted to create a sense that this was the only place where African American culture is touched and explored. So it meant that we had to find collections. And I remember being called in front of Congress and being asked a question about, well, is that going to be a problem? Can you find the things that are important? Because the key, remember, is that the Smithsonian, you could have the most technologically sophisticated museum in the world and it would fail. Because the Smithsonian, you come to see the Wright Flyer, the Greensboro lunch counter, the ruby slippers. So when the member of Congress asked me that, I lied. I said, absolutely, we can find it. I didn't know that. But I did know that the only way we were going to be successful is if we could recognize that all of the 20th century and most of the 19th century is still in the basements, trunks, and attics of people's homes. So the key was to create programs that allowed the public to know what we were doing and share their collections with us. So we created something called Saving African American Treasures, where we go around the country, partner with local museums, and bring people to help you preserve grandma's old shawl or that wonderful old photograph. It's not about collecting. It's about the Smithsonian and local museums helping to stimulate a conversation about saving our cultural patrimony. But what happens is that people get excited and they want to give. We tell them to give most of what they bring to local museums. So local museums do better, they get new collections, they get new visibility, but in the scholarly parlance, if it's really cool, it's coming back to DC. But that has really helped us because it stimulated a lot of giving, and I have been overwhelmed by what people have given us. I just am struck by thinking about a man who called me one day and said, listen, I have a collection of material that's owned by and used by Harriet Tubman. Now, I'm a 19th century historian. I knew there was no way in the world there was anything of Harriet Tubman, the great abolitionist, that we could collect for this museum. But he said to me, come on up, I'm in Philadelphia. And I thought, well, Philadelphia's not too far, and I get a cheesesteak out of the deal, so what the heck? So I go to Philadelphia, and this guy pulls out a box. And he reached into this box, and he pulls out photographs of Harriet Tubman no one had ever seen. He's got my attention. Then he pulls out a shawl, and there's a famous picture of Harriet Tubman 3 days before she died, wrapped in this shawl. And it turns out the shawl was given to her by Queen Victoria in honor of her work. And so already people are choking up. And then he pulled out a hymnal that had all those spirituals that Harriet Tubman used to sing when she'd go into the South and sing Sweet Low, Sweet Chariot or Steal Away Jesus to alert the enslaved that it was time to flee for freedom. And by the time he brought that out, everybody was crying. And when I said to him, what are you going to do with this material? He said, I'm giving it to the Smithsonian. And here is a collection that could have been sold for a lot of money, but it was given to the Smithsonian. And that happens over and over and over again. I'm struck by a woman who flew in from California without an appointment and said her grandfather was a black soldier in World War I, and she had a bunch of stuff in a bag. Would I look at it? She turns this bag over on my desk. It turns out her grandfather was a black soldier in World War I who fought for the Harlem Hellfighters. This was a famous unit that was so good, but initially the US government didn't want black soldiers fighting in World War I, so they gave that regiment to the French. So they fought in French uniforms, and they were so good, they were given the French version of the Medal of Honor, the Croix de Guerre. There on my desk was his Croix de Guerre from 1919. And I said to her, are you going to, before I could finish anything, she said, this belongs in the Smithsonian. And this happens over and over and over again. And I guess part of what has been so magical about this is that we've been able to find things I never thought we'd find. A Bible used by Nat Turner, the guitar that Chuck Berry wrote Maybelline on, the Oprah Winfrey set, so we've got Oprah Winfrey set. But what really hits me is that because of this excitement, people have really gone out of their way to help us find things that I could only dream of. One of the things I always wanted was to find pieces of a slave ship. People have never seen that because most slave ships sank. They're under the bottom of the ocean. So I had to create a project with scholars from the United States, West Africa, and Brazil to map slave wrecks. And we first looked for some off the coast of Cuba, but then we found one that had left Lisbon in 1794, picked up enslaved people in Mozambique, was on its way to Brazil, and it sank off the coast of Cape Town. And we have now found it, we've dived on it, and we're about to bring material up that I had never seen. We actually found a piece of wood that's 2 feet wide by 4 feet wide, 4 feet long, from the hull of the ship where the enslaved were carried, and still attached to it is a slave shackle. So that we're able to find things that I didn't expect us to do. And so in many ways, the collections have been that rich and are going to be one of the great strengths of the museum. But I guess before I talk about the building, I should talk about one other challenge, and that is the challenge of building a staff, the challenge of going from 2 to 150, the challenge of finding people who could do this job. Because what I realize is the visibility and the risk and the worry that people have of building a national museum made it hard sometimes to find the right people. Now, the good news is, for a while it was good news, that everybody wanted to work for the museum. So I felt like Abraham Lincoln. All I had was office seekers everywhere I went. One day, I get a call from a woman who said to me that she wanted me to hire her daughter, and that her daughter did work that we needed. Well, it turned out it was not a job we were looking for. It was nothing that we needed, and I said, sorry, we're not looking for this. Well, she said to me, don't you remember who I am? So I'm trying to search my brain, and she said, we were in high school together. So I'm sitting there thinking, Joanne, high school. I didn't like her then. So, I mean, I realized, so she could forget. That was not a good thing to say, but I didn't hire her daughter, but not because of that. But I think one of the things that I think this process has taught me, and I learned a lot of this by looking at startups and understanding the challenges of startups, is that often you can hire good people, but because you're asking them to do something so out of the box that they then revert to what they know how. I once said to one of the head of education for me, and I said, I want you to create the smartest online educational programs we can and the smartest mid-career teacher rejuvenation. That's what I want. She came back with a curriculum packet on black soldiers in the Civil War. It was brilliant, but it wasn't what I wanted. And I realized that the challenge was to help people feel comfortable where there was ambiguity, where there wasn't the path to go ahead. And so the joy has been that we've been able to get an array of people, and the only requirement was passion and not a jerk. Okay, those were 2 things that were important. It was hard to get that in the job description, but I think in some ways, if I said to you, the challenge that kept me up the most, it definitely was the building. From the day I arrived back, even after we had gotten the site, the question was, what's the building going to look like? Who's going to design the building? And we recognized that there were fundamental questions that this raised that were all colored by race. Did the architect have to be an American? Did the architect have to be an African American? What kind of team could you put together to do this if this was the quintessential American story? And what does a building for the African American Museum look like? If it was the early 20th century, you might say most African Americans lived in the South. Maybe the building has some Southern motif. But how do you in the 21st century find a structure that on the one hand marries Africa and America, but on the other hand is a building that speaks of resiliency, spirituality, and uplift? And this was going to be the first green museum on the National Mall. So you could imagine that a lot of people wanted to design this. In fact, when they announced I was taking this job, I was still here in Chicago and lived in Oak Park, and I was stunned. I was away on vacation, and I came back, and there were 15 packets from architects saying they want to design the building. I've suddenly had a lot of friends who were architects that I didn't know were my best friends. And what I think was the challenge was, how do you both define what you're looking for, and how do you define this process? So we decided to do an international competition. Linda, several members of the council, deans of architecture, architectural critics, we put together a group and we asked some of the best architects from around the world to submit. And we went through a filtering process after looking at about 127 different architectural teams to 6. And we asked those 6 to build a model, to make a presentation, and to tell us why they should craft this kind of institution. And head and shoulders above everybody was David Adjaye. He was part of a team that included Max Bond, who was the Dean of African American Architecture, who died very early in this process, and Phil Freelon, who is a gifted architect from North Carolina. But they put together a diverse team of people, and they came with this design that is pretty spectacular. And they came with a design that did several things. It first of all spoke of a kind of permanent dark presence that was always in the United States. And it talked about resiliency and uplift. And it was awfully beautiful. And so let me show you a fly-through of the building that would give you a sense of the placement and the look. So as you can see, this is going to become part of the signature view of Washington, D.C. And there are 2 things about the building that are crucially important to me. One is that normally when you go into a building on the National Mall, you're in the building. This is a building, however, that wants to take advantage of being on the mall, of those amazing vistas. So imagine seeing the exhibition on the March on Washington, then looking to your left and seeing the Lincoln Memorial. That this is really about letting people recognize that the mall is sacred space, that it's not just a building, it's part of the interpretation. And the other piece is, this is a bronze-cladded building. And one of the things with bronze is you can't have it completely solid. Going to blind pilots or whatever. And initially the architects wanted to sort of punch some holes in it to just make it look good, to break up the solid nature of it. But we came up with the idea of saying, why don't we do something that really honors the people who did a lot of the work in America? And so we took the designs from enslaved craft people of Charleston and New Orleans, and those panels, that filigree, is on the entire building. So the building in some ways is a homage to history in plain sight, to argue so much of our history is right there, we just don't know it. So in many ways, when I think about the challenges of this building, I am really humbled by the support we've had from the American people. But the other day, a reporter asked me something and it threw me off. He said, "What happens if you fail?" I didn't even know how to answer that. And I realized why I don't know how to answer it, because that's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because of things that have happened to me with this project. One of the things my staff knows is that I only have one superstition. I never got on an airplane without shining my shoes, okay? I know every shoe shine person in every airport. You want to know where they are? I can tell you. So normally when I go into a community, I spend 2 or 3 days on television, radio, in the media, and I'm pretty visible. So I was coming back from Texas, Dallas, I think, and I went to get my shoes shined. It's an elderly African-American man. He's shining my shoes, and he looks up and he says, "Are you that museum guy from Washington?" I said, "Yeah." So I thought we'd have a conversation. He said nothing. He just went back and shined my shoes. Fame is fleeting. And so then I got up and I gave him $8. And he said to me, "Keep the money for the museum." Now, I got to be honest, it's a shoe shine guy. So I pushed the money back, said, "Come on, man, take this money." And he said to me, "Don't be disrespectful. Don't you realize that even if I don't know what's in this museum, if you do it right, this may be the only place where my grandchildren understand what life did to me and what I did to life." That's why this will be a success, because there are an amazing array of people whose stories, whose histories, whose memories deserve to be stored, recorded, and preserved. And what I realized is that once this building is complete, as long as there's an America, there's an opportunity for people like that to be remembered. So ultimately, what we're trying to do with this museum is simple. We're trying to create a place that helps us remember who we once were, helps us understand where we are today, and maybe, just maybe, could point us towards a future that we all could envelop in love. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I am told I will answer some questions, and I will not tell you that I'm a Yankee fan. But other than that, I'll answer any question. Yes.
Do you have any plans to archive oral histories also?
One of the things that has been really important to us is to recognize that one of the challenges of history museums is that we often forget to humanize the stories, that we tell the big events of migration, of war, but we forget to humanize them. So we recognize that oral histories are the crucial way for us to be successful. So we have collected over 8,000 oral histories. Many of those we work with the StoryCorps program that many of you know, and we would air those every Friday. We also created a collaborative project with the Library of Congress that would allow us to collect stories from the civil rights movement. So oral histories are crucial. We've created a library that would also be in archives that would give people accessible, make these stories accessible. And so ultimately, we felt that we couldn't do this without hearing different ways to understand the history, and that's what the oral histories give us.
Hi, Lonnie. I was wondering how you are conceiving of, is there a main exhibition? Are there several exhibitions? What's the, how are you telling the narrative?
When the National Museum of the American Indian was created, they did 3 exhibitions. I'm so dumb, we're doing 11. And basically what we've decided to do is divide the building into thirds. So a third of the museum is a kind of historical narrative that takes you from Africa through slavery and freedom, through the era of segregation, civil rights, but takes you into the 21st century. Most history museums, if you remember, they stop about 1965. We thought it was kind of important to say this history continues. So a third is this kind of amazing narrative with just great objects. Then a second floor is a floor of digital education. It is really created for students and teachers with classrooms, a lot of high tech, but it's also where you do your genealogy, where you have access to the collections of the museum. And it's also where you then make the connections with your local community to find out what's happening in Memphis or Birmingham. Then you go to the third floor, and that's a floor of community. One of the things I realized when I was at American History is people would come to me and they'd say, well, how come we don't see our community in this museum? So we created a major exhibition that looks at regionalism, that gives you an understanding of what was it like to be African American in Chicago in 1919? What was it like to be African American in the Bronx in 1970? So we give people that sense, and they have the technology that they can leave their stories behind, so that we continue to expand our knowledge of community and community memory. But also on that floor, we have galleries that look at sports and the military. And then we go to the fourth floor, which is a floor of culture. And this is a floor that has a major gallery of African American music, looks at film, theater, and television, has really one of what I think is going to be really important, a signature gallery of African American art that would take you from Joshua Johnson and Bannister and Duncanson all the way to Carol Walker. And so the goal here is to take those three pieces and to then give us the opportunity, by having 3 or 4 different changing spaces, to be able to sort of wrestle with contemporary issues, change the tone, but also allow us to do something I think is really important, which is create exhibitions for others. So that's the goal we're trying to do.
We have time for one more question.
There's one right there.
Simple question. What's the largest item that you have in the collection? Crazy, simple, childlike question.
We collected a segregated railroad car from the 1920s. This thing is 80 tons, and it was so big, and a collector that I knew from my days at American History said, you want to come and look at this train? I was like, I don't know. But I went to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and there was this falling apart train car. But it had an amazing sense of, you walk in the front and the first 3 quarters were for the white community. Huge seats, the best bathroom I've ever seen. And then you go through a swinging door that says colored, and there were 4 benches. And I realized right then and there that I needed to have that, because I needed it so that people could walk through it. I don't have to explain segregation. I don't have to write labels. You walk through that, you'll get it. So the problem is that when you're a director, you have all these great ideas, and then everybody else has to implement it. Well, I didn't realize how hard it was to get a train to Washington, D.C., and the train was too big for the building. So we had to actually put it on the site while we were building the building. So that what's going to happen is, I'm going to tell you exactly, 50 years from now, a director of this museum is going to say, what was that Lonnie Bunch thinking? I've got this train car and I'm stuck with it forever. But that is the largest piece, and I think one of the most important pieces, as I said, to help tell a story that we don't have to write the word at all. So thank you all so much for listening. I appreciate it.